At first, it looked like just another Hollywood breakup story. Two stars, a high-profile marriage, and then silence. But years later, when Demi Moore finally broke her silence on Ashton Kutcher, what she revealed wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about jealousy. And it wasn't the kind of scandal tabloids had been waiting for. It was something far more uncomfortable and far more human. Because behind the red carpets and magazine covers, there was a relationship that slowly started to unravel in ways the public never fully saw. According to her reflections, the early days felt like a new beginning, a second chance at happiness. Ashton was younger, energetic, and to the outside world, their connection looked like a modern Hollywood fairy tale. But behind closed doors, reality was different. Demi later hinted that what started as passion gradually shifted into pressure. Expectations built. Differences that once felt small became harder to ignore. And over time, the emotional distance between them grew in ways that couldn't be fixed by appearances alone. What makes her silence breaking now so shocking isn't just what she said, it's what she didn't say for so long. For years, the story was told by headlines, rumors, and speculation. People filled in the gaps with their own versions of the truth, but her side of the story remained private, locked away behind carefully chosen silence, until now. And when she finally opened up, it wasn't about blame. It wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about understanding what really happens when two people try to build a life under constant public pressure, while dealing with very private struggles. Fans who expected drama found something else instead: reflection, honesty, and a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes love doesn't fall apart in one moment, it fades in 1,000 small ones. But the real question is, why speak now? And what does this revelation change about everything we thought we knew about their split for years? The relationship between Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher was one of Hollywood's most talked about love stories. When they first came together, it wasn't just another celebrity pairing, it was a headline event, a relationship that sparked curiosity, admiration, and constant public attention. But behind the spotlight, things were far more complicated than they appeared. At first, everything seemed exciting, a fresh start. Their relationship was widely seen as bold and unconventional, and for a while, it felt like they were writing their own version of a modern Hollywood romance. Public appearances showed smiles, chemistry, and a sense of connection that fans believed in. However, over time, the energy began to shift. What looked effortless on the outside started to carry unseen weight on the inside. The pressure of constant attention, combined with personal differences, slowly began to create distance. And while the world continued to watch them as a couple, the reality behind closed doors was becoming more fragile. In later reflections, Demi Moore opened up about this period with a level of honesty that surprised many. She didn't describe a single dramatic breaking point. Instead, she pointed to something quieter and more difficult to explain: a gradual emotional disconnect, a feeling of imbalance that built over time, and the struggle of trying to hold onto something that was already changing shape. According to her perspective, one of the most painful aspects wasn't just the breakdown itself. It was how long it took to fully understand what was happening while still inside it. When you're in the middle of a relationship, especially one lived under public scrutiny, clarity doesn't always come easily. And by the time it did, the distance had already grown too wide. What makes her recent silence-breaking reflections so significant is not that they reveal dramatic new accusations, but that they reframe the entire story in a more human way. Instead of a simple celebrity breakup, it becomes something more relatable: two people trying, struggling, and eventually realizing they were no longer aligned. Still, many questions remain. What exactly was the turning point? Was it something sudden or a series of moments that built up over time? And why did it take so long for her to speak about it openly? There are no simple answers. But what is clear is that this of her life, once defined by headlines and speculation, is now being revisited through a different lens, one shaped by reflection rather than rumor. And as more of her perspective comes forward, the story is no longer just about what ended, but about what was happening long before it did. When people look back at the relationship between Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher, they often focus on the beginning or the end. The romance, the headlines, the eventual separation. But what rarely gets discussed in detail is everything that happened in between, the long middle where things were still intact on the surface, but slowly shifting underneath. According to Demi's later reflections, that middle period was the most confusing part of all, because nothing looked wrong in an obvious way. There were still appearances, still shared moments. Still the effort to present a united front to the outside world. But emotionally, something had started to change in ways that were difficult to name at the time. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a gradual drift, and that drift created a kind of silence inside the relationship that became harder to ignore as time went on. In her perspective, one of the most difficult parts was the internal conflict, trying to understand whether what she was feeling was temporary or something deeper. That uncertainty can be more exhausting than conflict itself, because it keeps you constantly questioning your own perception of reality. From the outside, everything still looked functional. But inside, the emotional alignment was beginning to weaken. She has suggested that this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of relationships that exist under public attention. When a couple is constantly observed, there is pressure not just to stay together, but to appear as if everything is fine even when it is. That pressure doesn't fix problems, it often delays them. And in some cases, it makes them harder to confront. As time passed, the gap between appearance and reality reportedly became more noticeable to her. Conversations that once felt easy started to feel more measured. Moments that once felt natural began to carry hesitation. Even shared silence began to feel different, not peaceful but uncertain. At the same time, Ashton Kutcher was experiencing his own rise in Hollywood, building his career and stepping into new phases professionally. According to Demi's later reflections, that shift also contributed to a change in dynamics, not because success itself was the issue, but because life paths were moving at different speeds. And when two people grow at different speeds for long enough, connection becomes harder to maintain. Still, there was no single breaking point, no defining argument that ended everything. Instead, there was a slow realization that what once felt aligned no longer did. One of the most striking aspects of Demi's silence-breaking comments is how she describes that realization, not as dramatic, but as quiet and deeply personal. A moment where understanding arrives gradually, not all at once, and by the time it fully formed, the relationship had already changed shape. What makes this of the story so significant is that it challenges the way people usually interpret high-profile breakups. The public often expects a clear reason, a single incident, a moment that explains everything. But in reality, as her reflections suggest, it is rarely that simple. Sometimes, relationships don't end because of one event. They end because the connection that held them together slowly stops feeling the same on both sides. And that kind of ending is harder to explain because it doesn't come with a clear story. It comes with a feeling, a gradual awareness that something important has shifted beyond repair. Even now, years later, the way she speaks about it suggests not bitterness but processing. A continued attempt to understand something that, at the time, was difficult to fully see from the inside. And that raises new questions. How much of a relationship can change before it becomes something else entirely? At what point does adjustment stop being enough? And how long can silence hold the weight of things left unspoken? There are no definitive answers, only reflections. And in those reflections, the story becomes less about a celebrity breakup, and more about the quiet complexity of realizing that something once certain is no longer the same. As time passed, the story of Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher began to take on a different meaning, not just as a Hollywood marriage that ended, but as a relationship that, in hindsight, reflected deeper emotional realities that were not visible at the time. In her later reflections, Demi did not describe a single moment that shattered everything. Instead, she spoke in a way that suggested accumulation, small emotional shifts that over time became impossible to ignore. That is what makes this story different from the way it was originally understood by the public. There was no dramatic collapse in the way people often assume. There was continuation, adjustment, effort, and beneath all of it, a growing internal distance that was not immediately acknowledged. According to her perspective, one of the most difficult aspects was the emotional imbalance that developed quietly. Not in a confrontational way, but in a subtle disconnect, where two people are still present in each other's lives but no longer fully aligned in experience. That kind of disconnect is difficult to recognize while you are inside it, because daily life continues, routines continue, appearances continue, and from the outside everything still seems intact. But emotionally, something begins to loosen. She has suggested that this is one of the hardest parts of long-term relationships under public visibility, the inability to fully process changes in real time. Because so much energy is spent maintaining the image of stability. And over time, that pressure can delay emotional clarity. By the time understanding arrives, it often comes in retrospect rather than in the moment. In her case, she has described reaching a point where she could finally see the pattern more clearly, not as a single failure, but as a gradual divergence between two people evolving in different directions. That realization, while painful, is also what shaped her later silence-breaking comments. Not as an attempt to rewrite the past, but to finally articulate what was not fully understood while it was happening. Meanwhile, public perception of the relationship has also shifted over the years. What was once framed heavily by media narratives and speculation is now more often discussed in terms of emotional complexity and personal growth. People have begun to revisit the story with a more nuanced lens. Instead of asking who was right or wrong, the focus has shifted toward understanding how relationships can change without a single defining cause. Because in many cases, especially under public scrutiny, the truth is not found in one moment. It is found in the accumulation of many small misunderstandings, unspoken expectations, different emotional needs evolving at different speeds. None of these are dramatic on their own, but together they can reshape the foundation of a relationship. And that is what makes Demi's reflections so significant in this context. They do not offer a simple explanation. They do not reduce the experience into a single headline. Instead, they reveal the layered reality of what it can feel like when something important slowly changes form, not suddenly, but quietly, until one day it is no longer what it once was. And even then, there is no clear moment that tells you when it happened, only the awareness that it did. That awareness is what defines this of the story, not the ending itself, but the gradual understanding that preceded it. And with that understanding comes a different kind of question, one that lingers long after the relationship itself has ended. How do you recognize change when it doesn't announce itself? And how do you respond to it when it arrives too slowly to notice in time, in the years following the separation? The narrative around Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher stopped being just about a relationship that ended and started becoming something closer to reflection. Not on the relationship alone, but on what it meant to go through something so personal under constant public observation. In her later openness, Demi Moore did not frame her experience as a single emotional event. Instead, she described it as a long process of realization, one that continued even after the relationship itself was over. Because endings, in reality, are not always immediate in understanding. Sometimes they take time to fully make sense of. According to her reflections, one of the lingering effects was not anger or resentment, but clarity arriving slowly. A clearer understanding of what was happening emotionally during the relationship, and how much of it was difficult to recognize at the time because of the environment surrounding it. When a relationship exists in the public eye, there is an added layer of pressure that most private relationships do not experience. Every moment is interpreted. Every silence is analyzed. Every change is observed from the outside, often without context. And that external narrative can sometimes make internal truth harder to identify. She has suggested that part of her later reflection involved separating what was publicly assumed from what was personally experienced. Those two versions of reality do not always align, and reconciling them can take years. Over time, her perspective evolved from trying to explain what happened to trying to understand how it felt while it was happening. That shift is important, because it changes the focus from blame to awareness, from outcome to experience, and in doing so, it reframes the entire story. Not as a failure to maintain something, but as an experience that unfolded in ways that were not fully visible until much later. Meanwhile, public discussion around their separation has also matured. What was once treated primarily as entertainment news is now more often revisited as an example of how complex relationships can be, especially when lived under intense scrutiny. People look at it differently now, less as a scandal, more as a human situation with emotional layers that were not immediately understood. And that shift in perception reflects something broader about how audiences engage with public figures over time. Initial reactions are often shaped by headlines. Later understanding is shaped by reflection. In that sense, Demi's silence-breaking comments did not change the past, but they did change how the past is viewed, not by rewriting events, but by adding depth to them. Still, even with more clarity, there are parts of the story that remain inherently private. No reflection can fully recreate what it felt like to live through those moments in real time. And no explanation can capture every emotional detail of a relationship that existed between two people. What remains instead is understanding, that relationships can be complex without being dramatic, that distance can grow without conflict. And that realization can come long after the experience itself has ended. In the end, her story is not defined by a single revelation. It is defined by the gradual process of making sense of something that was once lived, then remembered, and finally understood in a different light. And that understanding is what gives this its final weight, not closure in the traditional sense, but clarity, the kind that arrives slowly and stays.